Hi, everybody. I'm Bara. You're listening to the Postkahanism podcast, a show where we discuss the past, present, and future, mostly of Israel, from a far right wing perspective. And today we're speaking with Malcolm Collins, who, along with his wife Simone, is a prominent pronatalist, and they've been featured in hit pieces in some of the foremost mainstream publications out there, like The Guardian, The Telegraph, and New York Mag. And could you give the audience
and we've got a Wikipedia page
background?
about us. We're the couple known as the elite couple breeding to save mankind and a lot of stuff. But right now, actually, most people, that used to be what we were known for. Now we're mostly known for our podcast, which is popular on YouTube, called Based Camp. And when you went in with the intro and you're like, oh, we do Israel from a far right perspective, I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely my area. It's one of the areas I sometimes even piss off my audience with. So background in venture capital, background in private equity. Before that, I worked in, I got my MBA from Stanford. Before that, I worked in brain-computer interface, neuroscience, and human evolution. But my most recent work, we did the Pragmatist Guide series, where we look at topics that academia can no longer handle in a mature context anymore and try to do pragmatic literature reviews. So we have the Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, the Pragmatist Guide to Relationships, the Pragmatist Guide to Governance, but probably the one that's most relevant to this podcast would be the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, which focuses on actually fertility collapse, in that we argue that the only realistic, and we can go deeper on this particular topic if you find it interesting, the only realistic long-term solution to fertility collapse is going to look something like a religion or be an existing religion. There just doesn't seem to be anything else that works. Hungary spent 5% of its GDP on this, and its fertility rates went up less than its neighboring countries, and now it has its lowest fertility rates in its history. France spends 4% of its GDP on this. It went down 7% year over year this year in terms of fertility rate. You don't seem to be able to pay your way out of this. Meanwhile, if I go within a city, within Manhattan, and I'm just, testing between two populations, obviously income stable, because all this is caused by raising income stable, two populations, you'll get 10 or 4x the fertility rate if I'm comparing income equal, a conservative Jewish family and a secular family or a Catholic family. Which often surprises people. A lot of people think any religion works here, and it doesn't appear to be that. Some religions seem to be much more resistant to fertility collapse than others. The two weakest of the Western traditions, i.e. they collapse the fastest in terms of fertility rate as wealth increases, are Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. But they're not anywhere near as bad as Buddhism or Sikhism or no, not Sikhism. Sorry, what's the one I'm thinking of in Japan? Shintoism. But yeah, just going off on a rant there.
So cool. This really leads me into a lot of stuff. I've got notes here, things that I wanted to ask you about, and this leads me right into the next question. So the population collapse has been in the works for maybe 150 to 200 years. When you look at Western fertility rates, they started dropping over the 19th century, and in some places more rapidly, in other places slower. But what's happened recently, why people are talking about this, is that now the trains arrived to the station, population, birth rates have gone below replacement all over the world, and they're continuing to drop. So meaning that every subsequent generation, there are going to be fewer and fewer people at this rate. What are the underlying causes, do you think?
So there's okay, so we can talk about the underlying causes. I think one of the biggest things that people need to note about this is that the powers that be have a vested interest in the public not realizing how bad of a problem this is, because the powers that be don't see it as a problem. So you can look at something like the UN Fertility Department, right? Like the UN Population Division, right? And so they'll do something like in 2019, when Latin America's population fell below replacement rate, they came out and they said, okay, well, yeah, it fell below replacement rate, but in the second half of this century, it'll level off at around 1.75. Well, 5 years, no, 4 years, just 4 years after making that prediction, almost every one of the large countries they were looking at, except for one, Mexico, had fallen below that 1.75 number. They said it was going to even out at the second half of the century. Then, not only that, you have countries all over the place. So you have a country like, Uruguay that in 7 years fell from around replacement rate 2.0 to 1.27 now. Just 7 years. If you look at Argentina today, people going into kindergarten, Argentina today, 4-year-olds, there's going to be 30% less of them than there were just 4 years ago. If you look at a country like Costa Rica, it might be sub 1 now for native-born Costa Rican women. And for people who want to read more on Latin America's fertility collapse, an article I'd suggest is in America's Quarterly, and it's called Latin America's Fertility Collapse is Accelerating and No Uncertain Why. It is really interesting. But the point being is that a lot of people, they look, and you can look at like modern UN statistics, and the people will look at what like the UN or the World Health Organization projects, and it looks like a steady, nice curve of human population. And then you look at their projected fertility rates, and the fertility collapse just like stops out of nowhere, or it stops going down out of nowhere. And you're like, where are you getting this number from? Like, why do you think it's going to do that? I can go ask millennials how many kids they plan on, not millennials, sorry, Gen Z, how many kids they plan on having. And if you ask Gen Z how many kids they have on planning, depending on the survey you're looking at, it looks like around 50% or over 50% are planning to have no kids. Like that would mean for the population to stay stable, the other 50% would have to have over 4 each. And that's like obviously not happening. But also, this is just not the way things were historically. So if you look at the, like in America, it would have been actually pretty rare for somebody to say they plan to have no kids. Yet, historically speaking, the realized fertility rate is always way below the expected fertility rate. So by that, what I mean is if you ask American women how many kids they want to have, you're going to get a projected FTR, total fertility, or TFR of total fertility rate of around 2.6. If you look at how many they're actually having, it's around 1.6. Okay. Right. So if we look at like the expected fertility rate right now was like half of young people planning to have no kids, it should be like off a cliff lower. And you can also look at rates of religiosity, where a lot of people just look at standard graphs of religiosity. But if you break out these graphs by generational cohort and you look at rates of religiosity in Zoomers and Gen Alpha specifically, it is like falling off a cliff, which I think a lot of people is sort of hidden because it's not dropping as quickly in the older generations. As to what's causing this, there's a panoply of things. There's the easy things that you can point to immediately that are, I don't know, somewhat non-controversial, which is to say biological things. So it looks like male sperm counts have declined by 50% in the last 50 years, or a little over 50%, I think. You can look at testosterone rates. They've declined by something like 30% in the last 20 years. In one survey, this is actually done in Israel, interestingly, they said in the developed world, by 2060, we should expect half of men to be infertile. So like we are having just an absolutely like biological collapse in human fertility right now. For people who want to know why that's the case, in the environment, if you go back to the 70s and 60s when the environmentalist movement started, like it was needed. Things were bad. Like lakes outside of major cities in the US were like catching on fire. And they fixed that. In London, you could die from like breathing the air. The London smog was literally deadly. It was so bad. But anyway, so they fixed all of that, but they never fixed anything that had to do with fertility because they always thought fertility was part of the problem. And so our reproductive gametes are basically still living in a London fog of pollution. Sorry, you wanted to interrupt or ask a question?
Yeah. Well, look, the environment, I have Haredim living not far away from me. Many of my friends are Haredim. They're constantly coming and visiting here. And the Haredi lifestyle is definitely not like, nobody's going, oh my God, don't drink out of that. There's BPAs. If you go to Bnei Brak and Meir Sharim, people are eating like garbage food out of plastic constantly and wearing plastic clothes and whatever. And they're having 10 kids per family. Meanwhile, you go down the road and there are people who are like, I can't eat that. It's not fair trade, blah, 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 or organic, and they're having 0 kids. So, well, barring the idea that there's like a secret Jewish tap that like we drink water out of, which not in my house anyway. What gives?
Well, so I was just starting with the things that don't actually matter as much. Like they do matter. Like quote unquote the economics of this, or the housing situation, all this matters. The biology matters, but the core thing that matters is, well, we'll get to it in a second because I think it's really interesting and it aligns with what you're talking about here. But I wanted to say that it does matter that we're becoming biologically less fertile because it's going to have a significant impact on some of the religious traditions which ban IVF. Which is just going to absolutely tank those traditions' fertility rates, especially if they have really late marriage rates, like Catholics, for example, do. Catholics, once they're married, remember how I said like Catholics have a really low fertility rate for their level of religiosity. Once they're married, they have the same fertility rate of any other highly religious individual, but they get married super late. But anyway, but not as relevant to the Haredi community. So if we're going to talk about like what actually caused all of this, the core thing is that kids used to be a thing of value to you. When people stopped having kids, it was when the kids stopped increasing your house's wealth. I used to be able to send my kids to work on the farm or go work in the factory. And so every kid I had, I was wealthier and living a better life. Now, every kid you have, you are sacrificing some quality of life. And so if you are going to have a lot of kids or anywhere near above replacement rate, you need some exogenous motivation to have the kids. Yes, your biological drive to breed may cause you to create kids if you're in a culture that bans contraceptives, or it may give you some degree of happiness that you can milk, sort of like from 1 or 2 babies. But the incremental more happiness you're going to get from like 6 or 7 babies, no, like that requires an exogenous motivator outside of your biology. And that motivator within our modern context can really only be theological in nature. Because if you look at society, right, like the urban monoculture, this is something we're always talking about, like the dominant culture, whether you're in Manhattan or London or, Tel Aviv, it tells you that you should value, your own personal happiness, and that you should avoid suffering. Like those are the 2 core things that matter. And it's one of the odd things. So people write hit pieces on us all the time, as you've noted. And one of the things that they'll say is like, well, it doesn't look like they, like being parents. Like they don't enjoy children or something. They said something like that. And I was like, I could argue with the specifics of that accusation, but that's the whole point, is that I shouldn't have to like children to want to have children. I do not have children to modify my experience of reality. I have children for their own sake. And I think that this is where, because I think the more interesting question than just, it's theology, is why is conservative Judaism so much more resistant to fertility collapse than other Abrahamic faiths?
I want to get into this a little bit further down. I just want to clarify something you said.
Yeah.
You kind of present the standard model that earlier, most people were peasants, and the more peasant kids I have, the more hands I have in the fields, the more cows we can milk, everything else.
Yeah.
And that's been decoupled. But actually today, at least the bottom half of society, or the bottom quarter of society, you get subsidized for having kids in Western nations, and you can make a decent amount of money if you're not you don't have a prestigious profession or whatever. And yet we don't really see the underclasses having tons of kids either. That used to be the narrative 20, 30 years ago, but we just don't see it. We don't see people who are working minimum wage jobs, or would be if they were working. We don't see them having tons of kids anymore either, even though they're incentivized to.
I just had a realization that I've never realized before, and so I made a note of it. But before I get to that, I want to say this realization that you made me realize, because I hadn't thought about it. Probably one of the reasons, and there's some other reasons that we'll talk about, but one of the reasons that conservative Jews are so resistant to fertility collapse is that they had to figure out how to motivate high fertility rates without a farming-based culture long before other cultural groups did. So when the Industrial Revolution happened, a lot of the Jewish populations that today survive, and we argue this in our books, that there were actually other Jewish populations that mostly didn't survive, which actually had a farming-based economy, but most of the ones that ended up being the ancestors of our current Jewish population were urban-based specialists. And because of that, they had to find out how to motivate a high fertility rate using their theology without while everyone else was still on the fields. Because if you look historically, when other cultures sent people to the city, facilities were always fertility shutters. Like they were always below replacement rate. But apparently they weren't for Jews, which is really interesting.
Right. If you look at Burton, right? Burton wrote a book. I can't remember his first name because we're doing this podcast, obviously, and therefore it escapes my mind. He was a Victorian adventurer slash researcher. You know what, man, I'm gonna have to give me a second. And he wrote a book called The Jew, the Gypsy, and Al Islam. Right at this time, he was Sir Richard Francis Burton. That's right. This was like in 1860, something like that. He was a consul, I believe, in Syria, and he wrote this book. And one of the things he wrote about the Jews, and he was not a huge fan of us, was that we had prolonged fertility. Jewish women continued having kids and healthy kids late into life. And that even though we would usually live in the worst and dirtiest and most crowded part of a city, we were not subject to the epidemics and plagues that our neighbors were. So, and a bunch of other biological stuff. He thought that we were hardier than the Gentiles because we have fasts and so on and so forth. I'm not sure how valid that is, but the Jews didn't have to. I mean, they didn't have to figure anything out. It's not as though there was some council of sages that 1,000 years ago went, how are we gonna, we live in cities, how are we going to maintain fertility? The default view has always been that kids are great, kids are a blessing, we should have lots of them. There is a big difference though that I found, because I have Yemenite friends, and I was speaking to them about this, and I said, how come there's only 50,000 Yemenite Jews came here after 1948. Didn't you guys have a lot of kids? And they said, yes. Our great grandparents, they would have many kids. They would have 10 kids per family. Most of them would die in infancy. And so they lost those compounding gains, unlike the Ashkenazim who materialized those gains.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and this also, when you talk about dying in infancy, a lot of people, when you look at, when they look at bad fertility rates, they see it as a modern problem. But going into World War I, if you go to the 1930s, half of the countries in Europe were below replacement fertility rates. They ended up jumping in fertility rates during the baby boom, which if you actually look at the data, I'm now convinced was mostly just due to lowering infant mortality rates. So it's really not a repeatable trick. Unfortunately. That was a huge thing. But when you asked a question before that I want to address as well, which is why aren't poor people having kids anymore? Because this is really interesting. Historically speaking, I always refer to it as prosperity-induced fertility collapse. And it is still true that prosperity does seem specifically linked to fertility collapse even today. So if you are wealthier in the US, at least, I haven't looked at this in Israel, but in the US, up until your family's earning over $500K per year, your fertility is going to go down per incremental dollar that you're making. So you have to have just an enormous amount of wealth before that starts increasing your fertility rate again. The interesting question here is, even with this being the case, now even fairly low income people are very low fertility. And so the question here is, okay, why are low income people low fertility rates? I think it's because low income people don't really exist anymore. And I know this is a controversial statement, but in most of the developed world, if you look at the US, nobody really lives like a truly low income person, or no, very few people do. The amount of social services that the United States has, from food cards to giving them diapers to giving them free daycare to they are not approaching the world in the way a low income person I think would have historically, and because they don't have the same sort of existential scarcity mindset, which is probably allowing for this fertility crash to hit them as well. One of the things we argue in a lot of our work is one of the things that used to make society work was hardship. Like when you remove hardship, particularly from the adolescent life, it seems to cause like really long-term negative repercussions in the way that their brains interact with reality. And a lot of religious traditions have sort of opt-in hardship traditions, which I think imbue an element of fitness in terms of mental health. But then there's also just this is another thing that we're actually talking about on our recent podcast, specifically around Judaism, because to the question of why are some religions more resistant to this than other religions, if you look at different religious holidays across religious traditions, they often convey the quote unquote gist of something that a religion is trying to tell or remind its members of. We argue that one of the big problems we have in the West today, so if you look at like in America right now, 1 in 4 girls, this is by the CDC, so this is like the America's Center for Disease Control, and this is like in 2011, I don't remember, sometime recently, 1 in 4 girls made a plan to unalive themselves on any given year, not over the course of their adolescence, on any given year. That's how bad stuff like this has gotten. And it's because people, when you ask young people today about their lives, they're like, my life is terrible. Like the world is terrible. Everything is hard. Everything is terrible. And I'm like, well, I mean, but like, have you compared your lives to like your grandparents' lives or like your great grandparents' lives? And they don't have any context for that. They realize that their life is marginally harder than their parents' life. But what I was going to make in regards to Judaism is pretty much or many of the major Jewish holidays are about remembering hardship from previous generations to imbue gratitude within the current generation. And very few of the Abrahamic faiths have this focus.
Beyond holidays, I mean, at least every male religious Jew prays 3 times a day or more on holidays and Shabbat. And the prayer is very interesting. It's basically a long series of blessings of God, thanking God for various aspects of, I guess, our present and future communal existence, and personal existence too. But also, nobody really like goes, wow, well, when the pioneers had a toothache, you were just kind of screwed. You'd have to have your tooth pulled and you walk around without a tooth for like that. That doesn't emotionally affect anybody. What emotionally affects people, I've noticed from my kind of varied life experience, is small victories, small achievements, doing something and then having your life improve at least marginally, accomplishing things every day. And the modern world and the modern urban lifestyle does not present a lot of opportunities for most people for that. So most people and most adolescents, their life is a series of places they have to go to, things they have to sit through, things that they can consume, ways they can anesthetize themselves. None of that gives you any real agency. At least in terms of like, I went and planted something and now there's a small tree there. I milked the cow, now I have milk.
It's funny that you mentioned this because, I mean, I think that you're fundamentally right. And that what in part has made this worse is that the biological instinct to search out these kinds of incremental achievements has been largely pacified through simulation, whether it's video games or et cetera, right? And I do think that video games actually pacify some useful instincts that, for example, males have, like war and stuff like that. But I think that you're absolutely right there. It's really hard. You need something, and I think what you're pointing out here, which comes back to a previous point I was making, is historically the human fertility rate was largely able to coast off of our biological instincts and self-interest driving us to create children out of a lack of thought. Now that humanity has to an extent awakened to a new degree of agency and control over their own reproductive processes, the people who are living this sort of animalistic pre-programmed lifestyle are just incredibly low fertility, and you need some alternate set of like software to motivate it.
Have you ever heard of I think it was called Silphium?
Or Silphium? No, tell me about this.
So this is interesting. There's a plant that grows or used to grow around the Mediterranean basin, which was a spice for food, I believe, but also it was in
Is this the heart-shaped leaf one?
I'm not sure. But it basically women could take it and not become pregnant. And they basically drove it into extinction because what we're going through is not fundamentally new, except for at scale, right? The
Yeah.
Greeks and the Romans had the same exact problems of high antiquity, right?
Yeah.
Um, and their fertility collapsed as well. Part of it was due to their kids dying off, but part of it was due to losing biological vigor, and part of it was just making the choice. I don't want to have kids; it's inconvenient for me. But even the people that had kids, you look at Marcus Aurelius; he had a few kids, and they all died except for the worst one, I guess. Um, but generally, there's kind of an underlying worldview here, right? And the worldview goes something like this: um, life is inherently pointless and full of suffering. Death is terrifying. And so what we need to do is just kind of anesthetize ourselves with pleasure and entertainment in the meantime.
You're absolutely right. Well, I mean, and if you live by this totally secularist mindset, it's a logical way to look at things.
Yeah.
It's not yeah,
Yeah,
it's
there's no
not
logical
illogical.
counter argument that you can bring. You cannot, it's a coherent worldview. It just leads you to extinction, right? And
Yeah, well,
this
I
is
mean,
kind of the fanatic urge, right?
yeah, and you pointed out something that's absolutely true. Typically, at the top of any civilization, right before it collapses, you have fertility collapse happen. And I think for a lot of people, they'd be like, "Yeah, the current world order does look like it's about to collapse." So, we're probably just seeing this repeat again. One of the things that I think can really change this is the way that a culture relates to the concept of children. Like, why are you doing it? And the core problem that the urban monoculture has is from the perspective of the urban monoculture, everything is inwardly focused. Everything is about how does this affect my life, or how does this affect the wider community? And they're usually negative utilitarian in their mindset, meaning that they value negative emotional subsets much more than they value positive emotional subsets. And they value in the person, in the moment, negative emotional subsets. So you can look at something like the Hayes movement, like the healthy at every size movement, which basically says, well, you shouldn't tell women that they're fat. You shouldn't tell women that being fat will cause long-term health complications because that causes in the moment suffering, even though it would reduce long-term suffering. Or like the trigger warning movement, which is basically like, I want to be exposed to no negative stimuli, right? So this group that is really focused on one, reducing suffering. So obviously don't bring kids into the world of happiness or pleasure or experiences don't matter, right? Like if none of that stuff matters and only suffering matters, then kids are a net negative. But even if you're not looking at it like that and kids are only meant to modify your own experience of reality, then even still, you shouldn't have more than really one or two kids, depending on what you prefer, which is going to have your population be way below fertility rate. Instead, even if you don't go to a theological perspective, but you have kids for, I think, one of the two core other reasons people have kids, which is one, either for their group. Like they're like, I like my community, right? Like I like my people. I want more of us to exist. And so they have kids for that reason, right? But that reason, you can't say that in the United States, right?
No.
Like you'd be thrown out a window.
Well, no,
So
no, 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 no. You can't say that in the United States. There are
yeah,
groups of people who can say that, but those groups of people aren't having a bunch of kids either.
yeah, they're not really. Yeah. And then the second way, and this is the way that my family relates to childbearing, is we have kids for our children's sake. And this is a very, I mean, I think that a lot of the successful high fertility religious traditions really see themselves as an intergenerational blockchain. And I think that Judaism more broadly does a very good job of coding for this. If when I read a lot of Jewish literature, it reads like a sort of intergenerational blockchain of the cultural group where every generation is adding their own, okay, and here's how we updated the protocol. And that makes it very easy to see your life as part of an intergenerational cycle instead of as atomic. And when you see that, you realize that your kids' lives and your potential children's lives matter as much as your own life or more, even to you. And this makes it very easy to motivate high fertility rates. But explaining this to the urban monoculture is just essentially impossible.
So there's two ways that you can look at this. What you're describing is basically what Burke said about a society, that it's a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born, right?
Mhm.
And this kind of view, there's a metaphysical underpinning of it, which is that, let me give you the converse. The converse is basically that we're a walking, talking piece of meat. We have certain, reflexes. We make noises. Don't do this to me because you wouldn't like it if I did it to you, and that wouldn't be nice, et cetera, so forth. But ultimately, there's no deep significance to my existence or your existence any more than there is to the existence or non-existence of a rock. But what you're talking about is that the existence of your children and their children, so on, it does have meaning. That there is something there between just some arrangement of atoms and molecules, right? And that kind of implies that kind of implies a soul by one description or another, right?
But it doesn't even need to. I mean, yeah, it kind of does, but I wouldn't say. So I often describe things. In this podcast, I've had my secular hat on in terms of how I'm relating to things. Like I'll say, I can explain this from a secular perspective, or I can explain this from a theological perspective. And right now I've been being totally secular in the way I'm explaining this. So if I'm going with my totally secular perspective, I mean, I think even from a secular standpoint, without bringing any concept of a soul or anything like that into it, I can be like, look, if I have a vested interest in myself, and I'm one of these people who wants to live like 10,000 years, like a lot of these like tech bros want to today, right? I talked to them, they're like radical life extensionists in San Francisco. And I'm like, what's the point, right? And they're like, well, I don't want to die. And I'm like, well, then why don't you just have kids? And they're like, well, but the kids aren't me. And I'm like, okay, so there's two scenarios. Either in 10,000 years, I come and talk to the entity that is you, that has lived for 10,000 years, and you're still recognizably you. If that's true, then you did not improve enough as a human for it to be worth keeping you around for 10,000 years. If you see one of the core purposes of your life as being constant iterative self-improvement, right? Or I come to you in 10,000 years, and while you have some traits that you have today, in the same way that, you might have some traits that a Jew had 10,000 years ago, there's not that much difference between you and another Jew from 10,000 years, or one of your distant descendants in that regards, right? And so I'm saying, so then what's the point? If you have kids versus if you live forever and are iteratively updating yourself enough for that existence to be meaningful, you will come out undifferentiated at the end of this 10,000 year period, except the iteration of you that had kids may have like thousands more of you existing or hundreds of thousands more of you existing.
Well, the point is that these people are very much afraid of dying, and they would like to avoid that experience at all costs. It's funny because I read recently that they did a study, and the group of religious people that were the most afraid of dying were Buddhist monks, which I thought was hilarious because, like, aren't you guys sitting there cross-legged for 18 hours a day, trying not to detach yourself from all this attachment? And meanwhile, you're far worse off than your regular guy walking around Williamsburg with a big beard, and a hat. Like, what did you accomplish? But yes, the bottom line is that they're very much afraid of dying, and the purpose of their life, I guess, is not to die, which is kind of sad and pathetic.
Actually, yeah, so it's funny, you say that's sad, but I think other people would see like the way that my wife and I look at things as sad. And I'd love to hear, I don't know what it is in the Haredi community, how they view death, or your community, how they view death. But in like my family, my wife and I, we talk about this regularly. Like, she more than me even, she's like, I'm quite looking forward to dying. She says, like, she says, my life is sort of like a ghost. Like, I have a set of unfinished things that I need to finish, and then I get to die. And that I exist for the impact I am going to have on future generations. And so, like, I don't want to die right now because I've got kids and I've got you and everything like that. But I am working hard enough to create a better future that life isn't like this existential bliss. But what's also interesting is when I look at the lifestyle that both of us live, where both of us are really genuinely, I do not care if I die, except for my kids needing to grow up and have support, and the world being in a dangerous place, and me maybe having a role to play to fix that. But in terms of like holding on to this individual life, whatever. We also have like one of the happiest lives of anyone I know in terms of like just general wholesomeness. And I think one of the and contentment and happiness and relationship quality. And I think so I'm going to break this into two questions. One is it's the wanting to die thing. Is this something that you see, not like wanting to die, but like genuinely no fear? Like it'll be a bit of a relief when it happens. And then the second thing here being that when you chase pleasure for its own sake, you're like just biologically, totally secularly speaking, it doesn't seem to work. Like the individuals who should have the ability to chase pleasure the easiestly, like ultra famous wealthy celebrities, seem to be some of the fundamentally least happy people I have seen anywhere in the world. And yet the people who just focus on a simple traditional family life seem to just have an abundance of actual pleasure in their life, but that pleasure doesn't make me fear death. But anyway, yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are on those concepts.
Well, I think you've touched on very important things. Aristotle, I think, said that if you want happiness, do not pursue happiness. When you have a larger context and a larger set of goals and other people whom you're living for, and you're busy, you're doing things, you feel that your existence has a purpose. And at the same time, you're less worried about, okay, what happens when my life ends? Okay, it's going to end at some point. Everybody's life ends at some point, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I was listening to an interview with with an older Haredi gentleman, and he was talking about how he got hit by a car and had to go into surgery, and the doctor said, most of the guys that go through the surgery, they don't come out, so say goodbye to your wife. And he did, of course, and he was talking to God, and he said, listen, if you want me here, I'll be over here. If you want me over there, I'll be over there. If I'm over here, I'm with you. Over there, I'm with you. It's all okay. There are, I think, levels of existence that we can inhabit, and one is the most animalistic. If it feels good, I'm going to do it. If it tastes good, I'm going to eat it, and so on and so forth. And it's a very sad existence because you have potential that you're not fulfilling as a human being, that you inherently cannot fulfill. And you're something of like a battery chicken in that mode of life, right? And there are other modes of existence where you're fulfilling more of your potential, which is what you were put on this earth to do. Whether, obviously I believe by God, you can say by evolution, whatever. The point is that if you see you go to the zoo and you see animals in cages, they look miserable. A lot of them are on antidepressants because they're not doing what they were put on this earth to do. And if you look at them in their natural environment where they are doing what they're put on this earth to do, they're so busy doing it that they're not worried about what's going to happen. Am I going to die? You look at a pride of lions or even, a deer in the woods. They're not like wrecked with this like paralyzing anxiety as though they were some sort of Sex and the City character. They're too busy making it in life.
Yeah. Well, I want to. One of the ideas that we came up with, and we have a podcast on this for people who want to see us like go into this idea further, is our levels of thinking system, which really builds on a lot of the ideas in the religion book, which is to say that you talk about these humans that are just driven by biological instincts. And while some humans are in this category, I don't think most humans are in this category. One of the really common categories, and I'd call it like lower moral system categories, is a system of ethics that I don't see a lot of people talk about. Like a lot of people, when they're dividing ethics, they divide it into like deontological versus consequentialist, when you're talking in a religious context. But there's this other system that's become very popular recently that I call aesthetic-based ethics. And so you see this in like men's rights communities where like people are trying to like re-understand what masculinity is. And so a guy in one of these communities, his name is Hamza, and he's like an influencer in this space, and he was describing how he made major life decisions. And he was like, I was trying to decide if I move. And so he asked himself, like, what's the most manly choice? He was asking himself an aesthetic question. Like, good for him was defined by confirming a gender identity, which it comes into one of these things where I say that gender dysphoria is not just a problem on the left. Like, it's a problem on the far right as well, where people build their entire lives and moral structures and decision matrices around trying to fit a gender aesthetic. But where this becomes relevant to a religious community is some individuals, as they relate to their religion, relate to it in an aesthetic context. And this has a very low fertility way to relate to a religious system, i.e., when I'm trying to act like a Haredi, I'm not asking, what does God want of me, from reading the books. I'm looking at like the way Haredis dress and act and everything like that, and I'm trying to act the most like that, instead of focusing on the the thing that's driving all of these behavioral patterns, i.e., God and the books and everything like that, and the culture and the history and the theology. And I think that's one of the things that has caused. I don't know if you've seen this in the Jewish community as much, but I've definitely seen this in various Christian communities. Is individuals, and I think that this is upstream of a lot of the problems Catholics have with their fertility rate right now. Is a lot of Catholics went back to aesthetic Catholicism instead of like okay, but what does God actually want of me?
You mean as a fashion statement?
So it's not exactly a fashion statement. So a fashion statement, like when somebody's doing a fashion statement.
Sorry. I mean a statement of identity and group allegiance, and so.
Identity
with
and
fashion
group
serving as a proxy for all that. So with the Haredim, okay, nobody makes a claim that what God wants is for you to wear a furry hat. That. Somewhere if you look in the Torah hard enough and the Talmud, and you will discover a commandment that says wear a hat which is round and furry. But God wants you to live in the community, and God wants you to, show visible allegiance to that community, and signal that even though I'm willing to look like a freak when I walk down the street in Brooklyn or in Tel Aviv and it's 90 degrees out and I got my furry hat on, or even 50 degrees or 30 degrees. I got a furry hat on and a long black coat, but I'm signaling something. And there's a lot of value in that. And let me give you an example. I wasn't born into a religious family. I was born into a family that was 4 generations past religion. And I became religious at a fairly adult age. I was 30 already after serving in the U.S. military, after finishing college, et cetera, so forth. And I came to Israel, and this was kind of a landmark moment for me in a minor way. I was on a bus, and I got off the bus in a place called Beit Dagan, which is in the middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And the Haredi lady got off the bus. She was like 25, something like that. She had a little, maybe 20. She had a little baby, was maybe a couple of weeks old. And we get off the bus, and she looks at me. She sees that I have a kippah, and I have tzitzit, and I have a beard. And she's like, yeah. And she doesn't say anything because it's not modest just to speak with strange men, like have conversations with them. And she's just like, hey, yeah, come here. She hands me off this baby. And then she goes under the bus and she pulls out her, folding baby carriage and like goes and unfolds it and like sets it up. He's like, oh, and like takes the baby and goes off to wherever she's going. So
that's like a very high trust culture.
That's a very high trust culture because I'm signifying allegiance to a community, allegiance to certain norms, and so on and so forth. And most people, when they go about their daily lives, they don't go, man, I'm going to put on this hat because God wants me to. I'm going to put on this hat because this is what we do. And I'm going to do all the rest of the stuff because this is what we do. It's very computationally intensive to constantly be trying to refer, to first principles and derive the minutiae of your daily behavior from first principles. They must ultimately be derived from first principles, right? Especially if you're going to succeed in something that's as against the mainstream as having a bunch of kids in a bottlenecking society. But you can't do it. I mean, maybe you can do it because you've got an IQ of 150, but no culture, no society can be built around a median IQ of 150, because that's just not how we're built so far. So I wanted to ask you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I want to build on something you're saying there, because it really, this experience that you're talking about. I think it partially encapsulates why Jewish. So this is something I've mentioned a few times, but I should really make this clear. I assume your audience knows this. But when you control for income and you're looking cross-culturally, no group is more resistant to fertility collapse than Jewish populations. They are just super, 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 especially specifically conservative Jewish populations, resistant to prosperity-induced fertility collapse. And understanding this, like a lot of people, when they look at my podcast, they go like, why are you so obsessed with like Jews and Jewish culture? And I'm like, well, it's like if there was like a zombie virus breaking out and there was like one community that like there were no zombies in, it's like you have an obsession with that community. You'd be interested. Why are there no freaking zombies in this one community, right? Like that the immunity is in the blood here, right? Like it's something here is allowing this community to preserve itself. And my wife says something to me in a modern context, which is like the first 18 years of your kid's life are a sales pitch for your cultural system. And historically speaking, Christian communities have created sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? Crutches for themselves that have hurt themselves because they've been the dominant cultural group in the environments that they grew up in. And so they built systems that ensured intergenerational cultural transfer by virtue of them being the dominant cultural group. And so, I will hear things where somebody will be like, well, if my kid deconverted, like you hear this from Christian families, like they'd know better than to do that, right? Like, and I'm like, well, what you just told me is if your kid had deconverted, he wouldn't tell you until he was self-sufficient. But historically, this worked. This idea of shunning and in-group punishment because there was nowhere else you could go often, and your parents would be alerted very early on in your deconversion process. So even when I was growing up, I was raised in a secular family, and my family was constantly warned by my school and by my teachers that I wasn't Christian. In this generation, you'd have the exact opposite thing happening, where if a kid was deconverting, it would be hidden from the parents. And if the parents were secular and a kid started to become a conservative Jew or Christian, the parents would be alerted that something was wrong. So these systems that tried to ensure intergenerational transfer, fidelity of intergenerational cultural transfer, religious transfer, based on threats and social exclusion are much less effective than the ones like Jewish ones. So the difference between the Jewish culture, again, I'm just looking at this from a secular hat. I have completely different theological arguments, but I don't want to go into them on this because of different theology. But from a secular standpoint, Jews historically were minorities in their communities. They always have to live with the threat of my kid during the day is going to a school where he's going to be constantly proselytized to by another group, right? I need to, or sometimes, not all Jews, but many Jews, lived in cities around other cultures that were trying to take their kids or convert their kids, et cetera, right? And because of that, they couldn't just threaten kids. They needed a kid to see that their culture, staying within their culture, was better, that their lifestyle would be better than if they left the culture. And I think that because rather than this threatening mindset, which many Christian groups have adopted and many Muslim groups have adopted to try to ensure intergenerational fidelity of cultural transfer, Jewish cultures, while some have this, it's much less the focus. And I think that that's what you saw in that hyper high trust environment where you're like, oh, this is a community that is better than the community of Manhattan or something like that, right? But I could be wrong.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think people inherently have the carrot and the stick, but in terms of Christian societies, pretty much anywhere that was anywhere, meaning the West over the last 200 years or even 250 years, if you became less religious, you'd be cooler. Meaning, like you look at the cool guys, 200 years ago in America, and not to mention France or England, like the really hip dudes. I don't think anybody was a biblical literalist. I think, and every generation, to be cool, you had to be slightly less religious than the past generation. All the way down to like today, where it's well, not today. Let's say in the 50s and 60s, it was the hipsters, and complete mass irony poisoning, where to stand up and go, yeah, guys, I do think that there's a God, and I do think that He's concerned with the minutiae of my life and my relationship to Him. That would be like marking yourself. I mean, can you imagine saying something like that to like your Ivy League friends? That's like marking yourself out as like the ultimate hick. Like, you might as well just be watching, I don't know, Pat Robertson or Billy Graham or I don't know what, like, unironically, that's like college Republicans territory of uncoolness,
But I'd also point out something that you're noting when you look at the earlier points in American history, and you look at the quote unquote cool people, many of them were fervently religious, but they were fervently religious in a different way than we as a society contextualize religiosity today, where they were part of what I call religions. Like, I divide them into two categories. You have dead religions and you have living religions. A living religion is when the theological conversation is still on the table. Like, they're coming up with new ways of interpreting things. They're coming up with new ways of seeing things, and this creates a lot of religious dynamism. If you look at early America, my wife was telling me we were going on a road trip through New England recently, and she realized, she's like, "Oh my God, I just realized that the early American towns, the churches were like social media platforms, because there'd be like 3 different churches that would be preaching 3 different messages, all in this one little area, and you'd get a choice to go to whichever one was most compelling to you. But before this, during the Catholic period, the preachers weren't chosen by who was most compelling to an individual. They were chosen by a large bureaucracy, largely speaking, and the people couldn't even understand what they were saying because they were speaking in another language. Now, Judaism has had an interesting evolutionary system for maintaining its living religious status. And this is something I talk about, and one of the things that has caused Judaism to evolve so quickly, which is to say that within Judaism, if the person speaking, the religious authority speaking, is challenged by somebody in the audience, and that person in the audience clearly has a better understanding of the subject than they have, that can cause shame for that individual. Now, that is never going to happen in a Catholic environment. Nobody is going to stand up to like a Catholic preacher and be like, well, I actually might disagree on this point, and here's my argument here. And you're also not going to have a choice. But within Jewish communities, you do have a lot more choice in terms of which teachings you're going with. And because you have such a backlog of scripture, you can have different people focus on different parts of that scripture, which can lead to different evoked action in different time periods, which can lead to a very different I guess I'd argue like phenotype was the same genotype. So by that, what I mean is if you consider Jewish scripture like the genotype of the religion, right? Well, you can get 2 phenotypes that look nothing alike. You can get the, you're talking about like the furry circular hat Jews, or you can go to the medieval period where their hats looked like Go pieces.
You have yes and no. For instance, there's a thing called tefillin, which male Jews put on their phylacteries in English, right? Put on their arms and on their head, at least once a day in the morning. And you can go to Yemen and you can go to France or Spain, and these are populations that are separated by 4,000 kilometers. And the last time they had their latest common ancestor was probably about 2,000 or 2,500 years ago. But both of them consider the other ones feeling kosher. And there's a ton of laws, what's kosher, what's not kosher. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to stand up and go, hey, guys, I checked the sources. And actually, on Shabbat, I can go smoke a cigarette. It's not a problem. There's a lot of stuff that externally is different, but everybody kind of has the understanding this stuff is not important. And here's the important stuff, and it's all interchangeable. There is an open standard. It's kind of like with software, right? There's a standard, there's an interface, everybody knows it. It's open source.
Well, actually, this is the thing you're talking about, right? It's the thing that connects to Teflon, right?
What? Tefillin? What do you mean?
The Teflon, the wrapping thing.
Yeah. What about him?
Well, the thing that you just mentioned, it connects to Teflon, right? Like they wrap the thing, and then the box.
Tefillin are the boxes and the leather straps.
And
you have one for the arm and one for the head.
My understanding was that while these can be found in archaeological sites from a long time ago, they really only regained popularity again in like the 1960s and 70s in terms of mass adoption.
No. As far back as we know, we have tradition. We have the halachot. Everybody wore them in the morning, and like on the head and on the arm. Yeah.
I guess
there was a campaign by Chabad because people had become irreligious, and these were the kind of people that were, they violate everything. Like they violate Shabbat, they eat whatever they want to eat, they go marry non-Jews, and so on and so forth. And one particular group of Jews called Chabad would periodically have different campaigns to raise awareness of Judaism. And so in the 60s, they had a campaign to raise the awareness of tefillin among secular Jews. But all the religious Jews were
This
put
is
in the
what I
bomb.
was thinking of. My
Right.
so what you're saying, so you can correct me if I'm wrong here. My understanding was that when these campaigns happened, that it was Chabad that did these campaigns, and this is what I was thinking about it, referring to, that there were some groups of conservative Jews where this had fallen out of practice.
No, no,
But
no,
you're
no.
saying in no group of conservative Jews had this fallen out of practice. It was only among the
When you say
secular Jews.
conservative, you mean that in you don't mean conservative as in the conservative movement, which is actually a misnomer.
No. I
You
don't mean
mean
conservative in the conservative
Orthodox
movement.
Jews, we'll
I
say.
mean like religiously devout
No.
factions. Okay.
All religiously devout Jews is going back as far as we have records would put on tefillin, uh, and the same kind of tefillin and whatever. What you're talking about was a campaign to raise awareness of this commandment among people that did not keep anything, that they were secular. They had no idea.
So it was just reawakening it with the secular population, not reestablishing it as a norm within the conservative populations.
Correct. So just like I had a question that we kind of glossed over. We were talking about falling fertility rates and we never spelled it out. So what's the problem? What's the ultimate endpoint of a society with falling fertility rates? So well, instead of, the planet is overpopulated anyways, we all know, right? Or we've been told since the third grade. And so instead of 300 million Americans, you'll have 20 million Americans or 50 million Americans. What's the problem?
Well, I mean, so one, we can talk about the fact that our civilization, not like our economy, but our civilization is a pyramid scheme based on an ever-growing population. Like our entire economic system, globally speaking, assumes constant growth. And that constant growth has happened only because the number of producers and consumers have been growing exponentially. So civilizational collapse is part of the problem, but it's only part of the problem.
A minor part of the problem.
It's a minor part of the problem. One of the funny things when I talk with progressives about this, and I like run them through the math, right? And they'll tell me, well, then we need to find a new economic system. And I'm like, great.
Check between the couch cushions. Yeah, it might be one in there.
Let's just rebuild the global economic system while we're flying. Like, let's rebuild the plane while we're flying. Changes in economic system look like the communist revolution. Like, those are horrifying, and we don't even have a plausible economic system that could replace this one. Like, what are you talking about? We're heading towards a disaster, and there isn't really any solution there. But then the secondary problem is culturally speaking. And this is actually a much bigger problem. So it comes in two stages. So stage number one is what we're facing right now, which is this thing I call the urban monoculture. So if you go to the United States and you go to before the 1970s, Democrats and Republicans had the same number of kids with only a 0.1% difference. This idea that the secular world had way fewer kids than the religious world was not true historically. So recently this has changed because the urban monoculture sort of adapted organically. I don't think any malevolent force was here. I just think that they became a low fertility culture due to many of the reasons that we've talked about. And then the culture had to evolve ways to keep surviving. And people deconvert from their birth religion or culture most frequently between the ages of 15 and 23. So the urban monoculture, the iterations of it that more aggressively targeted children in that age range ended up becoming a larger and larger part of the urban monoculture. And as the urban monoculture itself has become lower fertility, it's become more and more aggressive in child conversions, like in parasitizing the demographically healthy communities to keep its own population stable, which leads to I think a really sort of existentially horrifying environment for a lot of people because it's learned a lot of systems that it can use that are, well, just frankly, like abusive and terrible. So an example of this would be the way that you, like my family has had CPS called on us 2 times already. This is Child Protective Services. And why? What were we doing that was so abusive? Our kids wore used clothes and played outside with us watching from inside. Those were the tragedy things that we had done. They've created an environment where it is definitionally abusive to raise any realistic way of raising a large number of kids. Like we practice like light corporal punishment in our family. Not like spanking or anything like that, but we went like super viral for light corporal punishment, just slightly bopping a kid on the nose when he does something wrong, right? And when you have like 7 kids,
isn't that what the Nazis used to do?
yeah, right. Very, very. Yeah. When you anybody who has like 4, 5 kids knows that like you cannot manage this many kids without forms of like punishment, right? Like, you can't. They can't exist in a non-punishment environment. But the urban monoculture, because it doesn't need to motivate, like all religions in history had to find out how to raise good children that would stay in their culture, right? Like
But these
mentally healthy
guys
children.
steal other people's kids like an inverse cuckoo maneuver.
Yeah, because that's not how they survive, right? Yeah. But the urban monoculture, no, it doesn't need to impart any sort of good child rearing practices. It actually benefits from convincing everyone born in a high fertility cultural group that they were abused as children, because for a cult or a new religion to capture somebody, they often need to first sever the connections between that people and their support network, i.e. their parents and their birth culture or community. And so it redefines normal child rearing as abusive in order to separate those connections. Or you see this with, one of the things that my wife always talks about is she's like, thank God, like when I was going through puberty, some group didn't exist that told me, come to one of our meetings, like, we've got some pills for you. They will make you feel comfortable with your body again. And we will affirm you and tell you how great you are 24/7 and tell you everything that you think and do is amazing. And that if she had bought into this, she would be permanently like medically crippled and reliant on this community for the rest of her life for like protection. And yet like this has evolved within the urban monoculture as a very effective way of taking children from people. However, all of this is aggressive. We have to deal with it, but like we're winning right now. I mean, I assume that my family is going to get through this okay. I think my kids will be okay. Jews are clearly winning against the urban monoculture right now. Yeah, it's taking people from the culture, but it's not like that bad, right? Like clearly they're still surviving. But then there's the downstream effects of this, which are twofold. One is that the urban monoculture just pretty much, by the data, incontrovertibly, disproportionately converts more open-minded, pro-social, and intelligent people. Now, I don't think it's intelligent to join the urban monoculture, but if you're talking about like on average, that's who it's converting. That has a negative effects on the groups it's taking from. So if you take like a conservative Christian community in the United States and they have 10 kids every generation, and every generation of those, you take the 5 most open to outside groups people and you mimetically sterilize them, they're going to become more xenophobic intergenerationally. And this creates, like it sets up the stage for a massive global conflict that we might be heading into once the Pax de Romana of the urban monoculture falls.
So this is something that's one of the things that I read that changed my life in non-obvious but long-lasting ways was work by John Taylor Gatto, called The Underground History of American Education, where he described how mass compulsory public schooling had been basically bolted on top of American society and had sort of parasitized that society of its brighter kids. Because if you're a bright kid, maybe you don't fit in very well in this artificial environment you've been stuffed into, where you've got dumb kids, you got medium kids, you got yourself, and you guys are all in this kind of livestock feed pen. But hey, we got standardized tests, and this one says you're smart, and so we have places for people like you. And and of course, they're not in Kansas where you're from; they're actually in on the East Coast. And you're going to meet people that are like you. You're going to marry one of them through a sort of mating. You're not going to have any kids, but that's okay because the next generation of bright farm kids from Illinois is coming up or whatever. So this isn't new. But what is new? I was speaking on Twitter with a guy who he's a teacher in a Chabad school. I think he teaches probably like 6th graders or something like that, or 8th graders. And, back in the day, let's say 50 years ago, 60 years ago, mainstream Gentile American society was inherently very seductive. You had cool popular entertainment, movies and so on and so forth, interesting dynamic music, aesthetically pleasing people that were pushed to the forefront and everything else. Now you have weird, sexually mutilated looking people with purple hair And he said this makes his life so much easier because when he's talking to these kids, he'll say, listen, I know you guys right now feel like there's a lot of like state restrictions on you and this is a little bit stifling everything else. But here, look what's waiting for you out there. You want to be that? Like QED done.
I love this point that you're making because it's one that I always point out, which I'm like, when people are like, look at all the gains the urban monoculture has made recently, look at how much they've consolidated power. Like, are you scared? And I'm like, I am so much less worried for my kids than I would be for kids of this generation or my generation. Because in my generation, it was, okay, you could do the religious thing, you could do, you can practice self-control, you can practice self-discipline, or you can go out every night and party and have sex with anyone you want and do drugs and fun and alcohol. And it looked like fun. The alternate looked like a blast. To kids in this generation, the alternate looks like falling asleep to the sound of your own screaming and waking up to the sound of your own screaming. Like, these people are not happy.
My pronouns and my diagnoses, right? Like,
yeah,
pronouns and bio. Yeah. Horrifying.
Yeah, you just point, you're like, you don't want to be like that, right? Like, you see how horrifying that lifestyle is. And it's a much easier sell for them than I think it was in previous generations. But again, I think it's important that we all remember that the real enemy, the urban monoculture, is kind of a joke. I mean, it's sad that it basically takes people's children and then castrates them and then marches them through the streets in these big parades that like are Roman triumphs of cultural victory over these people's native cultures where they ship them in from. But it's sad, but it is at the end of the day a joke. It's a collapsing system. And the real threat of fertility collapse is that when people finally realize, oh my God, this is a civilizational collapse scenario in terms of like the global economy, they're also going to realize that there was this one strategy for getting through fertility collapse that was really successful across groups. And this strategy was to develop extreme levels of xenophobia for any outsider to prevent your children from talking to outsiders, to engage in practices that lower the economic productivity of your cultural group to basically caveman-like levels, because the lower income you are, the higher fertility you are, then to become incredibly anti-technology, anti-engaging in the economy. And you get this iteration of humanity that I can only describe as like a shadow of everything that makes humanity great, like the cross-cultural exchange, the intergenerational development and advancement, the engagement with philosophy and intergenerationally expanding philosophy, and eventually, when the urban monoculture's Pax de Romana, what I mean by this is when Rome fell, the Pax de Romana fell. And all of these groups that actually hated each other but were living next to each other were then like, oh, we're allowed to kill each other again? The urban monoculture may be gruesome in what it does to children, but if you look at the United States, for example, there's a lot of groups in the United States that want to kill each other but are not doing it because of the Pax de Romana from the urban monoculture. When the urban monoculture falls, and the worst thing about these shadow people is they all play on Highlander rules, we call it. Highlander rules, for your younger audiences, in the end, there can only be one. They believe that in the end, everyone must be within their cultural system. And I think Israel right now is experiencing what I would call sort of the first outbreak in violence of the conflict between the two groups that will be the inheritors of humanity after the urban monoculture falls. The group that is incredibly low economic productivity and uses that to motivate high fertility rates and extremely xenophobic of outsiders, and the group that is multicultural, high technology, high economically producing. And what they've seen is that when this other group attacks, the urban monoculture has reached a point where it's not really doing anything anymore. It's not defending. It used to defend. It used to say, no, you guys can't just randomly attack people near you. But it's not doing that anymore. It will come up with excuses because it has fundamentally taken a side, which is the side of this other. And I think that this other, and I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about like Islam specifically. There are groups like this that are Christian. There are groups like this in every single religious tradition. But they will start coming for other people eventually, and that scares me.
Okay. I think I'm less scared of it because of my background, and I'm aware of how incompetent these people are. Really, what gives them kind of a protective effect against what you refer to as the global monoculture, I think maybe on some corners of Twitter, it's called like the GAE, the Global American Empire, or the pause or whatever. But when you what gives them resistance to it is their incredible stupidity, and not even biological stupidity, but social stupidity, where when you get one of them aside, maybe they have some common sense, but when you have a bunch of them, they revert to some kind of lowest common denominator that's somehow virtual. It's even lower than the intelligence of the dumbest member of the decision-making group. So in the current war, there were two interesting things. In the beginning of the war, which was the worst day, and I think the worst day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust in terms of number of Jews killed, two things stood out. First of all, not a single religious kibbutz or moshav in the Gaza envelope was overrun, and I think most of them were not hit. Okay, there are, I think, 3 or 4, and none of them were overrun. None of them, I think most of them were not hit. The ones that were hit the most were the most secular and leftist ones who had been cheering the expulsion of the communities of religious Jews, largely religious Jews from Gaza 20 years ago. And in the places that put up any kind of organized resistance, I mean, you had community defense teams that had been mostly disarmed. Their rifles have been taken away. They had maybe a few rifles. They had some pistols. Any place that put up an organized resistance, a semi-organized, improvised organized resistance, was not overrun. So look at what's on the other side. The Hamas guys, these were their special forces operatives, effectively. The Nukba brigades were not your run-of-the-mill Hamas fighters. And they've been training for this thing for months and months and months. And they had the element of surprise. They had no air cover, and this was the best they could do, and it wasn't very good. So when you see how incompetent these people are, I think by themselves, they're not a huge security threat. They're a huge security threat in a place like Britain, where you have a police force that is dedicated to disarming you.
Yeah, well, no, I think that you really pointed out something important here, which is to say, sometimes people ask, like they're a little confused. They think that I'm like taking a riskier position intergenerationally than I feel I am. The urban monoculture will be like, why don't you side with us? And it's like, well, because you guys don't have guns and you're obviously going to be butchered. Like the iterations of you that exist when the Pax de Romana falls are not going to be able to defend yourself at all. And then there's the other group. And there's many Christians in the US, they ask me this. They go, no, you really should be disengaging with technology. You really should. And I'm like, look, when we're dealing with automated drone wars, one of the things I point out here, right? Like, I'm like, the Amish are a high fertility culture in the United States, but the Amish only exist because of the Pax de Romana, right? Like, if I could just go with a gun and take Amish land, I could. They're complete pacifists, right? Like, they exist because the state protects them. At the end of the day, and this also comes to my like intense pluralism. People are always surprised as to like why I'm so pluralistic. Like, why are you so pro people different from you existing? And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, it's strategic for my own survival. If you're not a majority cultural group or a majority population in the world, if you come at any sort of global conflict with a pluralistic mindset, you are immediately fit to be allied with anyone else who's approaching the world with a pluralistic mindset. Whereas if you are approaching it with an at the end only me mindset, all alliances are temporary and you can't have any real genuine long-term cultural alliances, which puts you in an incredibly vulnerable perspective. So I think that you point out the truth here, which is to say that it's somewhat self-evident which group ends up winning after the collapse of the urban monoculture, which is going to be an alliance of high-tech pluralistic groups. The question that I have, which I think is probably the most poignant for our generation, is who is going to be among that collection of pluralists. The only group that isn't really in question is the Jews. Like they're sort of already like the first group that's there, right? Like Israel. I often say that when I talk about where the global world is going, I suspect it to collapse into a series of like haven states. And by that, what I mean is if you look at a lot of people think like as the global economy begins to collapse, it will look like developing world economies, but it won't. A collapsing developed economy is much worse than a developing economy at the same economic level because the infrastructure was built not assuming that it would collapse like this. And a very good place you can go to study what does a collapsing developed economy look like is South Africa. Essentially, what you get is conclaves of wealthy, high productivity people who live sometimes under various like local basically warlords who extract protection from them or something like that, or they're able to defend themselves because they are very technophilic, very wealthy, and have very high-tech stuff like patrolling their compounds, little drone swarms, stuff like that. And I think that this is where the world is going, is as the world's core rare resource becomes competent individuals, those competent individuals can't be exploited by the state in the same way they have historically. So by that, what I mean is in the United States, for example, today, a huge portion of my income goes to supporting the lifestyle of people who aren't really producing anything for the future. And that worked historically speaking, because, competent people where there were always going to be more of them born. But now because an individual's competence, and I'm not even speaking genetically, I'm speaking culturally, like the more competent iteration of a culture. So if I drift towards some iteration of my culture that leads to higher IQ, higher economic output, I'm more likely to be taken by the urban monoculture. So the rare instances of competent resistance to this become such a valuable thing in the future that you get these haven states. And I often say that Israel is the first of these haven states, where one group of people with one sort of mindset correlated around an area. There are some potential questions that need to be resolved before it can be a stable system. But it seems well underway to do that, or much more well underway than any other place on Earth. The second point I would make here in regards to the core economic unit of value being competent breeding individuals in the future, historically, like this changes the entire economic model of the globe, because historically speaking, the core unit of value was anything that was fungible, like divisible and tradable, and had a set value, gold, land, anything like that, right? Because if the number of people is growing exponentially, then the number of set value things always increases over time. But that's not going to be the case in the future. And the final point I want to make here is a lot of people are like, okay, so it's going to be like a gradient of competence, right? Where like the more competent a group is, the more valuable they are, the more power they have. And I'm like, no, it's not a gradient. What it is a line here. Then everyone who can be replaced with AI is below that line, and they're next to nothing in terms of the global economy. And so if you can't get above AI in terms of your ability to produce, which I think a lot of humans are not going to be able to get above, globally, economically speaking, they're going to become irrelevant, which removes a lot of their ability to push cultural weight forwards.
So there are two things that I want to raise before the last, maybe 20 minutes we can speak about the Collins Institute.
Yeah. I was about to launch. I was reviewing the final ad today. So excited.
Yes, I really want to try to adapt it to my kids' needs in Hebrew. But wait, first thing, something we're seeing is this growing hostility towards people with kids, towards kids in general. You guys got really, I think, really vile coverage. And, more nationally, JD Vance recently made the obvious comment that angry cat moms now make up much of the ruling class and the technocratic, the bureaucracy. Yeah. And by definition, they don't have much invested in the long-term future of their society. Part of the hostility seems to be just personal, where these same angry cat moms would be the ones that would call CPS on you for having your kids playing outside, or would be writing the articles that are kind of so vitriolic towards you, towards JD Vance, towards pretty much anybody who reminds them of what they are and what their future looks like. Do you see this hostility increasing in the future, becoming more kind of radicalized? Or are these people going to just
it's obviously
retreat to
increase.
entertainment?
So if you look at the mouse utopia experiments,
Yeah,
which a lot
yeah.
of people compare this to. Why did they all die? Like, why wasn't it that the breeding mice ended up just replacing the ones that weren't breeding?
Because he
Because
said it was the death of the soul.
the ones that weren't breeding killed the breeding mice and their kids. And the question is why? Why did they do that? Why would you do that? And I think it's a social animal thing to do. You see it already. If remember how I said the urban monoculture, the biggest sin of the urban monoculture is experiencing any sort of negative emotional state. When they look at happy families, nothing could cause more painful cognitive dissonance. That their cultural hypothesis about how to live a good life isn't working. That me and my wife are happy and our kids are happy and we all love each other, and that is a form of violence against them because we are emotionally hurting them. When they recategorize any sort of emotional pain as violence, they categorized our very wholesomeness as a form of violence against them. And so that violence now become violence in response to our violence now becomes justified. Except when they say violence, they mean attacking, right? They mean like actual violence. Whereas for us, violence is just being happy but practicing a different lifestyle than them. And that is scary. But yeah, it's going to increase. And also you got to consider the antinatalist mindset and philosophy is certainly going to increase because the urban monoculture is, one of the thing about like feeling good about yourself all the time, never having to experience negative emotions is to believe that you are always the hero in anything you are doing. And once they realize, like once it becomes obvious that like it is actually a problem that nobody's investing in the next generation, they will come up with a philosophy that justifies the fact that they haven't done this. They're not going to change their behavior. They're going to come up with a philosophy that justifies that behavior. And as they invent that philosophy will intrinsically see people who have children as evil. From their perspective already, I'm killing kids by having kids. They'd say, well, if you didn't have a kid, that person wouldn't die, so therefore you're killing a person. Like,
this is kind of a very neo-Albigensian philosophy, right? Like what the Cathars had in medieval France, who were
I'm not that familiar with what Cathars in medieval France.
Cathars were a Gnostic or neo-Manichaean sect of Christianity in the 13th century, I believe, and their outlook was something like this: that the world is basically controlled by an evil entity called Demiurge or Satan, and it's kind of a machine built to trap and torture our pure souls, which themselves are composed of light. And so, because this world is basically a machine for inflicting suffering, the most holy thing that you can do is to not bring any more people into it. And their elite of their society would actually not have kids, not get married, and they would encourage what today we would call euthanasia, basically suicide by giving yourself pneumonia. This was the kind of people they are. The Catholics actually launched a crusade against them and wiped them out, which I don't think was a huge loss to humanity. But this kind of philosophy already exists, and it's existed since maybe the turn of the 20th century. It's been fairly prominent in intellectual Western circles. It really took off, I think, as automation increased. Because before, if you're running a society, you need a certain amount of people to grow carrots and make screws. But if I have this machine where this one dummy can make all the screws you're going to need for a city for a year, then why do I need him to have kids? Okay, maybe you can have one or two kids. And so the more efficient the technology becomes, the more these people's downsides outweigh their upsides. They create pollution, they listen to objectionable music, they beat their wife and kids, whatever. Let's just convince them to channel their reproductive energies into another means.
Yeah.
Right. And so this isn't anything new. But as you say, it may become crazier and crazier as these people kind of realize that nothing awaits them but a lonely and miserable end, being attended to by robots at best.
At best, yeah. Well, and as your community increasingly becomes a source of violence to them.
Yeah, there's this cognitive dissonance, where you're causing them to feel negative emotions, although really most of the time they live in the screen anyway.
Yeah, it's
So
true.
the opportunities for you to inflict violence on them by having your kids run around and be happy and make noise, I mean, they're not out there anyway. They're sitting at home waiting for Uber to bring them their slop.
Well, in Israel, you have a bigger level of protection against this than we have in the U.S. I mean, keep in
No,
mind in
no,
the
no,
U.S.
no, no, no. In Israel, we have what's turning into a civil war. I mean,
Oh, really?
we've had it. Well, maybe you could have me on your podcast some other time, and I'll tell you all about it. Yeah, what we're in the middle of, and what October 7th was an episode of, was basically a cold civil war that turned into a civil war by proxy, and it's died down a little bit, but it's going to flare back up. Um,
Mm.
all of these things that you're talking about, our secular elite feels them, and our secular middle classes feel them, and they say them, and they say them on TV very openly.
Yeah, well, I mean, so for example, they might be lazy couch people, but in the United States, 37% of American kids have had CPS called on them. And if you look at like even high-profile wealthy people, Elon Musk tweeted recently, this happened to one of his friends in California, that the school told them either you start affirming your child's new gender or we are taking your child from you. And the family was like, okay, yeah, sure, absolutely. Next day they were out of the state. But like, it's getting to that level. There was I think a black family in New York that had their kid taken from them. There was a family in California that had their kid taken from them, and then she ended up committing suicide. Really, really tragic. So like this is happening, that they use the bureaucratic apparatus. Now it's clumsy. It's not as effective as our systems, but it's not no threat at all in the short term. But it is, yeah. I mean, I'm sure you see this as well. You know, the war is a
Oh
real
yeah.
war.
Oh yeah.
And it's for children. Like it is for, and this is the interesting thing. You know, a lot of people, they think that when I'm afraid of, you know, I point to the loud things. You know, I point to the, you know, gender transitioning like 7-year-old stuff, right? You know, I'm like that's messed up. Like, you know, but it's not really that what I'm afraid of. What I'm afraid of is the existential lack of purpose that people who get sucked into this feel. This nihilistic dread for everything, and it's like the nothing from the never-ending story. You know, when people lose hope, they're easy to control. And that is what the youth have become. When I look at these statistics, like the one I mentioned was 1 in 7. We want to know 1 in 4 girls creating a plan to unalive themselves on any given year by the CDC statistics. 1 in 10 people in U.S. high schools attempting to end their lives every year. Like this is if this was something other than like the US school system, and I was like, everyone who ate Cheerios, like all the kids who ate this, like 1 in 10 are trying to end their lives every year, people would be like, we need to like burn every Cheerio in like a giant fire. Like these things are demonic. What are we doing with them? But you know, there's a recent statistic I saw that showed me that in the US school system right now, 1 in 10 kids has been sexually assaulted by a teacher by the time they graduate K through 12. So like it's just you're throwing your kids in like a trash can, which is interesting because my kids, we're taking a system which is different from other groups, but I based it looking at what groups work and what don't, where we are letting our kids go to public school and saying they can stop whenever they want. But I never want them to feel that we force them to stop public school. You know, it's got to be their choice. And today was my kid's first day at school. And obviously saying all this, I'm terrified. I'm like, have we spiritually and culturally fortified him enough to make the right decision? But I'm not going to make that decision for him, because I know if I do make that decision for him, he's much more likely to rebel, and he's much more likely to go seek out information that I kept hidden from him.
It can be weaponized against you too, right? Again,
Yeah.
that's the standard story of a cult is, you know, the people that you think love you actually don't love you. This that they're actually abusing you. This actually intersects with what's called the first story, which is a Eurasian kind of archetype, where the hero is cast out into the wild and has to regain his noble status, which he didn't maybe know he had, blah, blah, blah. And so this is kind of an inversion of it. So I think that's very wise. I wanted to kind of give you the opportunity or ask you to talk about the Collins Institute, what you guys are building, and also perhaps Simone's political plans, although she's not here with us.
Yeah,
Unfortunately.
she's definitely my better half, and that's why I always stave her for work, because she's a very productive person, and she's doing a lot today. Yeah. So I'll start with the school. Like at the end of the day, if you can win the battle of the educational system, you win literally everything. The entire game you win by winning the educational system. Because as we've talked about, people in this diverse alliance of conservative groups, and when I say diverse alliance, I mean genuinely diverse alliance. If you talk to like a progressive Jew or a progressive Muslim or a progressive Christian, and you ask them, what are your views on, gender roles or sexuality or what a marriage should be or what's moral and what's immoral or what the broader universal cosmology is like or what happens to you after you die, they're going to have about the same answers. They practice superficially different holidays, but they're really one cultural group. Whereas if I ask, conservative Jews and conservative Catholics and conservative Muslims and weird religious subtypes like me, or like Elon Musk, for example, another weird like conservative religious subtype, their views on these things are going to be wildly different from each other. But they're all allied because we are afraid of our children being parasitized. And so the way that we win is by stopping this cycle, right? But also it's the only way to viably have a large amount of kids and stay technically competent, at least in the United States, because education costs so much, right? Like I cannot send 13 kids to college. I just can't. Like I don't care how much money I have. That's unrealistic in the extreme. And if I had enough money to send 13 kids to college, I shouldn't have 13 kids. I should have 100 kids. So what we are instead doing is building an alternate school system. It's finished for anyone who wants to email me about it. We just haven't launched it publicly yet because we're waiting on getting like the how to use it ad done, which is, one of those, bouncy, all like, oh, this is how this works, this is how this works. It's just really good. I was just reviewing the first draft today. But essentially what we've done is we've taken all human knowledge, so there's 5,000 something skill nodes, and we've built like a skill tree or a tech tree like you would see in a video game. And every individual node represents like a subject that you can learn. And so you click on it, and then it gives you a summary of that subject, a place where you can take a test to pass the node. It's a very simple, like 8-question test. It's not really meant to judge your skill. It's meant to keep you honest about your own knowledge of that skill. And then, but it's pulling from a very large question bank of like 80 skills or more, 80 questions or more. And some of them are written answers and they're judged by AI. And some of them are picture answers and they're judged by AI. So like, if you're doing the food ones, make egg 4 ways, because we do everything, not just the typical school stuff that's judged by a picture, by an AI. And so we also then, under the skill nodes, we have a list of all of the places where you can learn this information online, and users post their own stuff. And so you can think of it as like, almost like, okay, Wikipedia, except it's grouped into pathways of learning, so that you can achieve a full education. And every article on Wikipedia then had all of the best places to learn about that, but a Reddit thread underneath it, where you would then vote on, okay, this is actually the best place to learn about this. And then the whole system is edited by users. So any user can edit something, and it just needs to be approved by one of the moderators, who we basically vet to make sure that they're not like extremists on any part of the spectrum. And if parents don't feel that something is appropriate for a student, they can block it out from that student's skill tree. And so the idea here is it's completely self-directed. People are like, well, who's going to be the teacher for the student? Who's going to sit down and tell them what's right and what's wrong? And I'm like, well, I think that's sort of the core problem we have in our society today. People are supposed to decide for themselves what's true, not have an authority tell them what's true, at least in a secular context, and especially not if that authority is a minimum paid bureaucrat. They're going to have very weird beliefs about what's right and what's wrong. And I think that you can't really fix the educational system without creating an alternative to a teacher. And so then people are like, well, what? So kids are just going to go out and learn this themselves? They're just going to go out and ask AI and research it on the internet? I'm like, yeah, it's not just about learning. It's about teaching kids how to relate to learning. They have ownership of what they're learning, and they're not being told this is what to learn or this is what's not to learn. And what I can say is we try to make this as comprehensive as possible. We go over everything from hanging drywall to Nazi occultism. We cover every single topic I could conceivably think of in this tree, which is really fun because kids won't feel unless their parent is I'm just going to block out huge parts of the tree around maybe sexuality or something. They won't feel like anything's being hidden from them, which is very important to me because I think that that's the core way that this sort of urban monoculture gets in the back door of religious traditions. Is they're oh, you parents didn't tell you about this. Well, here's this whole self-replicating mimetic framework I'm going to stick in the back of your head. But yeah, that's what we did with that. Oh, her political campaign. Yeah, she's running for office, state house in Pennsylvania. I hope we win, but really, it's probably mostly top of ticket stuff. My long term plans are to become more and more like the new right in the United States is really growing in power right now. JD Vance, obviously, selection as VP being a huge example of this. And Simone and I are like really, really solidly on the new right. For people who don't know what the new right is in the US politics, if you go to the 1990s, the Conservative Party was mostly an alliance of a theocratic faction and a big business faction, and then big business left and went super woke. It's actually kind of funny when I watch TV shows from the 90s and like corporate guys are all like conservative coded, and now it's like I probably couldn't even get hired at McKinsey because I'm publicly conservative. And then after that they broke off, the theocrats couldn't win anymore on their own, and so then Trump sort of catalyzed a new voter base, which was just people who felt that the system had screwed them over and wanted to change it. And then this voter base ended up recruiting between Trump's two election cycles, the tech elite. So it used to be that like people who had made their own money. Yeah, intergenerational wealth and big business was Republican, but like the tech entrepreneurs were all progressive, 90s, right? Now the tech entrepreneurs, the people who made their own money, are all moving to the Republican side. Whether it's Elon or Peter Thiel or Chamath or Vivek or David Sachs or people like myself or people like JD Vance. And a lot of people are a little confused by this. And I think it's because they misunderstand what the Republican Party in the United States has become when it's become an alliance of different factions trying to save their children and create some iteration of a future for their country. But two, the core difference between the Republican and Democratic parties right now is not about like people get it wrong. They think it's like the 90s lines. Like it's like, dude, in the Republican National Convention, marriage isn't even defined as between a man and a woman. Like it's not like it is not the party of the 90s. The core difference now between the Republicans and Democrats are twofold. One is the Democrats are the party of the urban monoculture. The Republican is the urban monoculture defense front. But then two, the Democrats feel that they can fix this country through iteratively updating the bureaucracy, and the Republicans think the bureaucracy just needs to be torn down, and we need to build a completely new system. And that is how basically they lured the tech elites to their side. Like there was the backwoods Appalachian people who were like,
Curtis
the system
Yarvin,
is
basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Curtis Yarvin, you said?
Yes, it's Curtis Yarvin.
He's a friend. I like him.
Yes, retire all government employees. Right, that idea.
I don't agree with all of his theses, but he's definitely part of this new right. I mean, the new right, the thing is people are like, well, then what does the new right want to replace it with? And it's like, well, there's competing hypotheses. Curtis Yarvin is one of the competing hypotheses. Simone and I are probably another one of the competing hypotheses.
Yeah. I'm personally of the school of thought that you really can't vote your way out of this unless you have one vote, one man, one vote, one time. But that's not really going to work as a platform for obvious reasons. But you can definitely, if you're talking about enclaves of competence and freedom and sanity, definitely playing the political game has got to be a component of the strategy to ensure those, so that you can get through the impending fertility collapse, much as the people who live in Orania and South Africa presumably have to deal with local South African politics, even though they don't think that South African politics are going to, there's not going to be like a referendum, and if you vote for the right thing, then you're going to return to a functional, productive society. So I wish you guys all the best.
Absolutely.
For that.
Well, and I'd actually encourage people in these situations. The United States is still okay for now, but there may come a day when you just have to leave. Like South Africa, I think if you want to have a future, you should leave the country. Like if you want your descendants to have a future, find a place more culturally aligned, because I think there's going to be much more geographic disparity in the future than there is today.
Well, look, South Africa was. Parts of South Africa were founded by people who were willing to go on the Great Trek and go live completely outside of the European sphere of influence, and make their way among the Bantus that were around them and the Bushmen and so on, and hammer out whatever arrangements they needed to hammer out, however they needed to hammer it out. I'm not sure. I have a lot more hope for people living in Orania for the long term than you seem to. Just because,
Yeah.
as you've alluded to, if you have a local warlord or some sort of local party structure, and you're sitting on the most precious resource that's out there, um, they don't need to be very smart to refrain from slaughtering and enslaving you, and
Yeah.
from to hammer out some kind of mutually beneficial arrangement with you.
Well, when your people become the core resource, I mean, this is the thing. So if you look at the plans for the October 7th attack, right? I'm getting the date
Yeah.
back. It was released like what they planned on doing, and the elites who were organizing this attack, they recognized like the land of Israel didn't have value. They wanted to capture Jewish people and use their labor to make money. They were like, oh, it's the plan was to enslave a portion of the Jewish population, right?
The plan was to take them hostage and extract concessions.
Oh, I thought it was
No, they
concessions,
weren't
wealth.
kidnapping these kibbutzniks in order to they weren't kidnapping them in order to have them making microchips in the tunnels or whatever. Um, they were kidnapping them to secure concessions, uh, political concessions that would make the next phase of their struggle easier.
Oh, my understanding, and I could be wrong here. This was a post by Richard Hanania where he did this. Is that obviously in the very first wave when they were just kidnapping people, right? Like that was just to extract concessions. But I thought they actually had like a plan to conquer Israel, like a delusional plan. But it was.
I very much doubt it. I mean, this is kind of like this is kind of like the kind of territory when you start reading about Hitler's theory that the Earth was hollow and they could, get in from Antarctica or whatever. This is,
Well, yeah,
this
but
is like
Hitler did
stuff.
believe that, right?
I doubt Hitler believed
Or something like that. Like he had some crazy.
There were people around him who believed all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't think that. So when you look at the long-term plan of Hamas, I think I know what you're referring to. When you look at the long-term plan of Hamas, like once we conquer Israel, like what are we going to do with the Jews? And Hamas said, look, the ones that have committed crimes, and have served in the army and all this stuff, like they gotta pay. And the rest of them can get on their stupid boats and they can go sail off to Poland or wherever they came from. But we are going to need the ones that know how to be doctors and know how to be scientists and all this stuff.
This is what I was thinking of. What you're talking about.
I see what you're saying. So yeah, but this was like real pie in the sky territory. You know what I mean? This is literally like Hitler in like 1944 going, all right, what are we going to do with Montana? Like.
No, I understand it's pie in the sky, but it's useful to, from my perspective at least, to understand what the unrealistic goals are of a community, because then I know, like, a community can be like the entire October 7th attack was an insane thing to do. Like, obviously, it would hurt. Like, you have to engage insane people on their terms to best predict their behavior. Because if you had said, oh, they'll only attack if they're logically going to get some benefit from it, you would say, well, of course they're not going to attack.
No, that's not true, because every previous attack has yielded them political benefits. How did they get Gaza in the first place? It wasn't through like strumming guitars and singing about peace at all. It was through, decades of terrorism and concessions, and then more terrorism, and then more concessions.
I guess you're right. Yeah, their popularity has gone up.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And anything short of like a complete like defeat where Israel takes land back and expels people is going to be instantly reframed as a win, like a heroic win, and and that's the game here. But I think more kind of to the point, how does a cohesive, productive minority survive in, surrounded by violent retards, right? And to that end, the experience of the Jews, everywhere from Poland to Yemen is very illustrative, because the guys that are leading the retards are not necessarily retards. And if they're retards, then somebody else will come along and kick them out of power and take over. It's good to be king, right? And so with these guys, you can make some kind of arrangement to say, listen, you can benefit from our productivity and from our intelligence, and you got to give us certain rights and concessions and the ability to govern ourselves and the ability to raise our kids, and don't mess with us too much here and there. The problem with all this is it's subject to constant revision for political reasons.
Yeah.
You can get an instant 30% boost in the Polish peasant popularity polls by going, hey, you know what, debts owed to Jews are forgiven, and you can just go get them yourselves and help yourselves to anything else you might want, right?
Yeah.
And Spain and everywhere else, right? So this is a huge problem for what you're discussing. But on the other hand, these people were a lot more vital. Like it's
Yeah.
just difficult to see. It's difficult to see like the um, productive residents of San Francisco hold themselves a good program right now. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, yeah, the productive residents, and that's the thing, is the productive people are largely pluralistic. There's really no productive group that isn't pluralistic because it's obviously the correct strategy. I mean, the future is going to be, as you talked about, while it may become more violent, things like drone swarms with AI in them are going to be better at protecting groups that are competent. And there's no real reason once you get like big swarms of automated drones for two groups that have these to send them against each other, because that's just game over. That's the same as like nuclear apocalypse. But it's much easier to protect a community with these from a community without these.
Sure, for sure. Or a community that has them but can't maintain or operate them.
Yeah,
because of reasons
anyway.
between their ears. Okay, cool. So listen, Malcolm,
love chatting.
I really appreciated your time. I'm going to put this up probably in about 2 weeks. And any links to the Collins Institute and any other resources that you send me, I'd be happy to put up.
Collinsinstitute.org is easy to find for people, but really, you just want to email us and we'll send you what you need if you want that. Basecamp is my wife and mine's podcast. We go just like offensive conversations. That's what we try to focus on, about like sex, politics, and religion. And if people are like, "Oh, I want to know your religious thoughts," because my religious thoughts are very weird, which I've into, they can go to our Tract series on Basecamp. But other than that, yeah.
Tremendous. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
All right.